Last spring, I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the Ozarks. I needed some time to clear my head. Life in the city had been wearing me thin, and I craved the isolation and beauty of the wilderness. I'd done solo trips before, but nothing quite like this. The Ozarks are vast, rugged, and full of mystery, and that's exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear, left my phone behind, and headed out for a 4-day trip that I hoped would reset my perspective. The drive out was beautiful. Rolling hills and endless forests stretched in every direction, and by the time I arrived at the trailhead, I already felt lighter. I parked my car, hoisted my pack, and set out on foot. My plan was simple. Hike about 10 miles into the woods, set up camp near a creek I'd marked on my map, and spend a few days exploring before heading back. The first day was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was different. I know it sounds strange, but there was a heaviness in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. The birdsong I expected was sparse, and the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush was conspicuously absent. I chalked it up to being overly aware of my surroundings. I was alone, after all, and tried to shake off the unease. I reached the creek by late afternoon and found the perfect spot to set up camp. The water was clear and cold, surrounded by a canopy of trees that filtered the sunlight into soft, golden beams. It was peaceful, and I quickly forgot my earlier unease as I pitched my tent and gathered wood for a fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with the sounds of insects and frogs. I cooked a small meal, leaned back against a fallen log, and stared at the stars. It was exactly what I'd come for. That's when I noticed something odd. The forest was loud, too loud. The frogs were croaking in a strange, rhythmic pattern, almost like they were in sync. At first, I thought it was kind of fascinating, but the longer it went on, the more unnatural it felt. It was like they were following a conductor. Every few minutes, they would abruptly stop for several seconds, plunging the forest into total silence, only to start up again, perfectly synchronized. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a quirk of the ecosystem here. But deep down, it unsettled me. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Maybe a dream, or perhaps the quiet. The frogs and insects had stopped their symphony, and the silence was deafening. I lay still, listening, when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, but deliberate, coming from somewhere behind my tent. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but the steps were too heavy, too measured. They circled my camp slowly, crunching the leaves in a steady rhythm. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the small hatchet I kept by my sleeping bag. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear, but there was nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it must have been an animal. Maybe it heard my voice and ran off. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I barely slept for the rest of the night, clutching the hatchet until dawn. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. About 20 feet from my tent, scratched into the bark of a tree, was a symbol I didn't recognize. It looked like a crude spiral, with jagged lines radiating outward. It wasn't there the day before. I was sure of it. I stood there for a long time, staring at the marking, trying to convince myself it was some kind of natural phenomenon or an old carving I'd missed. But it was too fresh, too deliberate. I thought about packing up and heading back to my car, but pride got the better of me. I wasn't about to let some strange marking ruin my trip. I told myself it was probably left by another hiker, a harmless symbol with no meaning. I tried to put it out of my mind and went about my day exploring the area around the creek. That night, the forest felt different again. The frogs were silent from the start, and the air felt heavy, almost electric. I sat by my fire, trying to enjoy the solitude, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, I saw it. Across the creek, just beyond the reach of the firelight, something moved. It was tall, much taller than any person, and its silhouette was vaguely humanoid, but wrong somehow. It stood perfectly still, just watching. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice cracking. "I can see you." It didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it across the water, but there was nothing there. The shadow had vanished. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the darkness, but eventually I forced myself to crawl into my tent. I zipped it up tight and lay there, gripping the hatchet, every muscle in my body tense. That's when I heard the noise. It started as a faint hum, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder and more complex, like a chorus of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The sound seemed to come from all around me, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. I wanted to run, but where would I go? The noise grew louder and louder until it abruptly stopped, leaving a ringing in my ears. And then, silence. When morning came, I packed up my camp in record time and hiked back to my car without stopping. The forest seemed normal again. Birds chirped, and the sun filtered through the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just out of sight. I haven't been back to the Ozarks since. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But no explanation feels right. I can't explain the footsteps, the symbol, the shadow, or that sound. And I have no proof. No pictures, no recordings, just memories that haunt me. I don't know what I encountered out there, but it wasn't natural. And I'm not sure I ever want to find out. Last fall, I decided to camp in a remote section of the Ozarks that I'd never explored before. The area was known as Devil's Gorge, a place steeped in local legends about missing hikers and strange happenings. I'd read enough online forums to know that most of these stories were just urban legends, tales spun to thrill tourists or scare off those too faint-hearted to venture into the wilderness. I didn't believe in ghost stories or any of that nonsense, but by the time I left the area, I wasn't so sure. I'd planned for a 3-day trip, aiming to hike into the gorge, explore some of its lesser-traveled paths, and camp by the creek at the bottom. The drive to the trailhead took me through winding back roads, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to press in on me the further I went. By the time I parked my car and shouldered my pack, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the forest feel ancient and alive. I hiked in about 6 miles before finding a flat spot near the creek to set up camp. The air was cool, the sounds of running water soothing. The isolation was exactly what I'd been craving. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and spent the evening reading by flashlight. Everything was perfect until the voices started. It was late, probably close to midnight, when I heard the first sound. I was lying in my tent, halfway between awake and asleep, when something snapped me to full consciousness. It wasn't an animal sound, like the rustling of leaves or the call of an owl. It was a voice. At first, I thought I must be imagining it, but then I heard it again. A faint murmur, distant but distinct. It came from deeper in the gorge, somewhere beyond the creek. It was too quiet for me to make out words, but the cadence was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was talking. I lay perfectly still, straining to listen. After a few minutes, the murmuring stopped, and the forest fell silent again. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind or the sound of water echoing off the rocks, and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, the memory of the voices lingered, but the daylight chased away most of my fear. I convinced myself it had just been my imagination, fueled by being alone in an unfamiliar place. I decided to spend the day exploring the area, following the creek further into the gorge. That's when I found the tracks. At first glance, I thought they were animal prints, barefoot, with splayed toes, like a bear or a large raccoon. But the more I looked, the less they made sense. The prints were human in shape, but larger than any person's foot I'd ever seen, with long, claw-like impressions at the tips of the toes. They were scattered along the muddy bank, heading deeper into the gorge. I thought about turning back, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the tracks for a while, but they eventually disappeared into the rocky terrain, leaving no trace of where they'd gone. Uneasy, I returned to camp. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking just beyond the firelight. The forest was too quiet, the usual sounds of insects and nocturnal animals absent, and I know that that can indicate a predator nearby. I knew I wasn't getting much sleep that night. Around midnight, the voices returned. This time, they were louder, closer. It wasn't just murmuring now, it was laughter. High-pitched, childlike giggles echoed through the trees, bouncing off the gorge walls. It sounded like there were at least 2 or 3 of them, though I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the trees. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The laughter stopped instantly, as if cut off by a switch. My heart pounded in the silence that followed. Then I heard it, a twig snapping just beyond the edge of the creek. I, in fact, didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire with my hatchet in one hand and my flashlight in the other, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. Around 3 a.m., I saw them. At the edge of the firelight, 2 figures stood silently. They were thin, almost emaciated, with pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Their hair was long and matted, hanging in tangled clumps around their faces. They weren't wearing clothes, at least none that I could see, and their posture was hunched, almost animalistic. But it was their eyes that terrified me the most. They were too large, too reflective, shining like a predator's in the dark. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching me. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, one of them tilted its head, as if curious, and let out a soft, guttural laugh. Then they turned and disappeared into the forest, moving with an unnatural grace that made my skin crawl. As soon as the sun began to rise, I packed up my camp and got the hell out of there. Every step of the hike back to my car felt like a race against time, like they were following me just out of sight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw them again. When I reached the trailhead, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief until I noticed something on the hood of my car. Scratched into the paint was a crude depiction of what I think was me, my campsite, my tent. They looked like something you'd expect from a child, although, admittedly, I don't think I could do much better. I drove away as fast as I could, heart hammering in my chest. I haven't been back to the Ozarks since, and I don't think I ever will. I've told this story to a few friends, but most of them just laugh it off or accuse me of making it up. Maybe that's easier for them than believing there's something out there, something that watches, waits, and laughs in the dark. I don't know what I encountered in Devil's Gorge. Feral humans? Spirits? Something else entirely? All I know is that I'll never forget those eyes or the sound of that laughter. Camping has always been a refuge for me, a way to disconnect from the stresses of modern life and reconnect with the simplicity of nature. That's why, in the early spring of last year, I decided to head out to the secluded part of the Ouachita National Forest. I wanted to be alone, just me, the woods, and the endless sky. It was a spot I'd read about in an online hiking forum, a hidden gem, they called it, far from the usual trails and untouched by the hordes of weekend campers. It was exactly what I needed. What I didn't realize was how far it truly was. After a long drive down increasingly narrow dirt roads, I parked my car at what seemed to be an old, unused trailhead. The path ahead was faint, overgrown, and winding, as if the forest was trying to reclaim it. But I was undeterred. This was part of the adventure. The hike was harder than I expected. The trail twisted and climbed through dense trees, the sunlight barely reaching the forest floor. It felt like I was walking into another world, the kind of place where time moves differently. After hours of hiking, I found it. A wide, open glade surrounded by towering pines and dotted with wildflowers. A narrow creek trickled through the middle, its water sparkling in the late afternoon light. It was perfect. I set up my tent near the creek and spent the evening exploring the glade. The air was cool, the sound of the water soothing, and the isolation complete. I didn't see a single sign of another person. No footprints, no trash, no fire rings. It felt like I had stumbled upon a hidden paradise. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. The woods around the glade were alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owl calls. I felt completely at peace. But then, as the fire began to die down, the atmosphere shifted. It started with the silence. The crickets stopped chirping. The owls fell silent. And even the rustling of the wind in the trees seemed to fade away. It was so quiet, I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I've experienced moments of eerie silence in the woods before, usually when a predator is nearby. But this was different. It was oppressive, like the world itself was holding its breath. I told myself, It was nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow beyond the firelight seemed to move. Every flicker of the flames cast strange shapes against the trees. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. A low, rhythmic drumming, like someone tapping on a hollow log. It came from the forest beyond the glade, far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint the direction. It wasn't a natural sound, not woodpeckers or falling branches. It was deliberate. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the edge of the glade. The trees loomed tall and silent, their shadows stretching like black veins across the ground. The drumming continued, steady and methodical, growing louder as if it was moving closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The drumming stopped. For a moment, the silence was complete again, and I thought maybe whoever, or whatever, was making the sound had gone. But then, from the opposite side of the glade, a different noise began. This time, it was a faint, melodic humming. I turned my flashlight toward the source of the humming, and my heart nearly stopped. Just beyond the edge of the glade stood a figure, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and thin. It was draped in what looked like tattered rags, though they blended so seamlessly with the trees, it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was looking at me. The humming grew louder, more discordant, as if it was coming from inside my own head. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Leave me alone," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, humming. I don't remember much about what happened next. One moment, I was staring at the figure, frozen in fear, and the next, I was running. I didn't even grab my pack. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly in front of me. The humming followed me, echoing through the forest, always just behind me, no matter how fast I ran. I tripped and fell more than once, scraping my hands and knees on rocks and roots, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. At some point, I lost the flashlight. The darkness was absolute, and I had to rely on the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees to guide me. The humming never stopped, though it began to fade, growing fainter and fainter, until, finally, it disappeared altogether. By the time I reached my car, it was nearly dawn. I was dirty, bleeding, and shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached a gas station miles away. When I finally had the courage to look in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Stuck to the back of my car was a piece of tattered fabric, the same color as the rags the figure had been wearing. I ripped it off and threw it onto the ground, then sped away. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was a person playing a cruel prank, or maybe I let my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I know it was something else, something I can't explain and never want to encounter again. I haven't been back to the Ouachita National Forest since, and I've stopped camping alone. Some nights, when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can still hear that faint, melodic humming